Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin our third day looking at Unit 5.1, the Enlightenment, and we're going to be focusing on application to women's rights. So once again, our learning objectives is looking to explain the intellectual and ideological context of the revolutions, and of course, this one is more catered towards the second learning objective, is looking at how the Enlightenment affected societies over time. Right, and see if we can get some application for the Enlightenment ideals in the case of women's rights here. Right. So your homework last night, just as a reminder, is you were given these three documents, and you were just basically asked to just figure out what the main idea of the passage was, and then make that connection to the Enlightenment. Whose ideas were being applied. Right. So for the first example, you're looking at the power of the government comes from the citizens, and citizens have a right to change the government, right? So that is a kind of idea of a social contract. And you could have gone one of a couple of ways, right? But the stronger way to go here would be the application of John Locke, right? So keep in mind, both John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau are known for a piece called the social contract. So both say that there is a social contract that exists between the people and the government. But there is a difference in the justification provided for the overthrow of that government if a breach is made, right? So in the case of John Locke, he's advocating this idea that the government exists for the preservation and protection of natural rights, and as long as the government does that, then that is fine. But if the government fails to protect individual civil liberties, individual natural rights, life, liberty, property, then that is the justification, right? So violation of protection of natural rights. Whereas the Rousseauian view of this is slightly different. He is simply looking for the will of the people to be expressed through the government, and if the government does not express the will of the people, then that can be toppled. Right, so kind of a different way of looking at a similar thing. All right, so we started today, right after we went over the homework, just looking at, since we're going to be talking about women's rights and women's equality and political equality, we started here, and I asked to source students to source this document in one way. And in class, we went through and sourced for historical context, intended audience, the purpose of this document, and so we also discussed who this was, and some of the point of view limitations associated with that. Right? So and of course, if you're looking at context, this is January 3rd, following the midterm election in 2018. This is when the House of Representatives, was the new chamber, the new session was being sat. All right, so kind of looked at what was going on around at that time in the United States to contextualize this document. As far as the point of view, we talked about who this was. We also talked kind of platforming and sourcing a platform. Right? Can you do that? I did have one student who pointed out the color of his tie as an identifier. I thought that was kind of a funny thing as well. All right, so we did that in class, right? And then I kind of went through and showed the post-2020 elections. So the current, now that we're in 2021, the current House of Representatives. So, the 89 to 89 is the same. 13 goes up to 28, right? And then I kind of did a demographic breakdown as well, right? And so again, just talked about why this particular individual did not make this same tweet in the year 2021, right, in January of 2021. So other things going on. Maybe it was just other things going on. All right, so after kind of starting that and kind of just looking at the kind of overall numbers, 117 out of 435 members, that kind of where is women's equality today, and what does that mean? All right. So kind of after starting with that, we looked at some of the Enlightenment thinkers, right? So what do these Enlightenment philosophers have to say about women's equality, right? So can the women's rights movement use the Enlightenment thinkers like Thomas Jefferson does with the Declaration of Independence, or like Simon Bolivar does in the letter from Jamaica. Right. So here's from Emile in 1762. This is the same year that Social Contract was published by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. All right, so what does he have to say? The first difference that may be observed between men and women in their moral relations. One should be strong and active, right? Talking about men. The other, weak and passive, referring to women. One must necessarily have both the power and the will. It is sufficient for the other, women, to offer little resistance. This principle being established, it follows that woman was specifically made to please man. If man ought to please her in turn, the necessity is less direct. His merit lies in his power. He pleases simply because he is strong. I grant you that this is not the law of love, but the law of nature, which is older than love itself. If man is made to please and to be, if woman is made to please and to be subjugated to man, she ought to make herself pleasing to him rather than to provoke him. Her particular strength lies in her charms. By their means, she should compel him to discover his own strength and put it to use. All right, so is this a document that women are going to be able to, women's equality, fighters are going to be able to use as some supporting evidence for their cause, right? And I think the answer is quite obviously no on this one, right? So what does this mean? When you look at the Enlightenment philosophers, right? The Locke's, the Hobbes, the Montesquieu's, the Rousseau's, the Voltaire's. I mean, these guys write about a lot of things. They write a lot about ideology and politics, and try to apply some empiricism to these things. But they also try to do the same to other topics as well. So they do talk about gender and slavery and religion, and so they write about a lot of other topics. So the question becomes, can people later on kind of mine these for their purposes? And if this is what you come across, how do you use this? All right. So what we're going to see with the women's rights movements is sometimes we are going to see modifications of some of the arguments made, and sometimes we're going to see rebuttals of some of these arguments made. All right. So what this means is we can't just start talking about women's rights with Rousseau, right, or Voltaire. We have to start with people who are actually advocating for equality amongst the sexes. All right. So, and a good place to start is with Mary Wollstonecraft. All right. So, very famous, very well known for her piece Vindication of the Rights of Women. Right. That women be not prepared by education to become the companion of man. She will stop the progress of virtue. Right. So, very influential writer, very influential piece, and you may or may not have done some reading from her in your English classes, but most of you probably heard of her daughter, Mary Shelley, who writes this very famous social critique about the Industrial Revolution, and the dangers of unchecked scientific innovation, a book called Frankenstein, right? So you may have heard of her daughter, Mary Shelley, right? But she, obviously is a trailblazer herself. So let's just kind of do a quick little summary here. Right. So what is the Vindication of Rights of Women about? Right, Wollstonecraft will argue that all men and women have equal natural rights. Right. So what do we see here? We see a modification of an Enlightenment ideal. Right. So who is the Enlightenment ideal modifying? Right. So read that again and think about it. Hopefully you should figure out that is modification of Locke. Right, so she's modifying Locke for her own purposes. An ideal society could not be realized until everyone was free to exercise those rights. And so she's now making her own arguments here that if you want to maximize the potential of society, then you cannot do so with 50% of the population, in a house, not being allowed to fulfill their potential, whatever that potential is. She also spoke out against the situation of women in the 18th century, declaring that they were educated to be over-submissive to men and to value physical attractiveness over character and intelligence. Right, so what are we seeing here? We're seeing an actual rebuttal, right? So what is this a rebuttal of? It's a rebuttal of that piece that we just read a minute ago, right? So this is a rebuttal of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? And yes, so kind of understand the context in which she writes in, right? Women are not as educated as men overall, although, obviously, some parents will make decisions to educate their children, right? So like Mary Wollstonecraft's. And women, generally speaking, are restricted by laws and customs that made women look to marriage as a means of stability, right, and thus dependent on men. So, due to their favored position in society, right, due to their position in society, men were able to excel in public life, and that is science, philosophy, religion, politics. While women were expected to marry and have children and take care of home. And in your homework from Strayer the other night, when you were reading about the scientific revolution, you did read about some female scientists, right? So there's going to be some exceptions to this during the Enlightenment period, but just contextually speaking, generally speaking, this is true. All right. All right, so let's read a quick little excerpt here. In fact, it is a farce to call upon any being, right, to call any being virtuous whose virtues do not result from the exercise of its own reason, right? So a person is only virtuous if they use their mind, right? If they use reason. This was Rousseau's opinion respecting men. I extend it to women, right? So now she's modifying Rousseau's argument in this situation. But for this epoch we must wait, perhaps, till kings and nobles, enlightened by reason, and preferring the real dignity of men to childish state, throw off their gaudy hereditary trappings, and if then women do not resign the arbitrary power of beauty, they will prove that they have less mind than men. Right? So, of course, now we're hundreds of years later, and women generally have kind of fulfilled the call of Mary Wollstonecraft, right? Women no longer care about beauty. They no longer wear makeup or try to wear things to impress people simply for the sake of something shallow and non-virtuous, like the pursuit of reason, right? So, yes, you can kind of see how old this document is, right? All right, I think I'm just gonna skip by the rest of this but you're welcome to kind of pause and stop this. So let me kind of put it here for a second if you want to pause and read through. I'll also put this on Classroom if you want to read some of these other excerpts if you are interested. All right, so feel free to pause and read through. All right, and we also see here Wollstonecraft's not just writing, for the sake of knowledge, but she's also, kind of interacting with people who have the ability to enact change. And, contextually speaking, she is British, but, who had the ability of, to kind of make the greatest gains for women's equality? It was not in England at the time. It was in France. So you can kind of stop and read through this and see she's advocating, right? She's advocating, beyond her own home country for the rights of women elsewhere. So that because this is where kind of the biggest opening was at that time, to try to fulfill some of her ideals. All right. All right, so in class we took a few minutes and we kind of like your homework. We went through this, and tried to apply. See what is she doing here? So the question is, what is she doing here? Is she espousing an Enlightenment ideal? Is she modifying an Enlightenment ideal, or is she rejecting an Enlightenment ideal and going about her own way? Right. So which of these is she doing, and of course, who is she either evoking, modifying, or rejecting? Right. So I attribute to a false system of education gathered from books written on this subject by men who, considering females rather as women than human creatures, have been more anxious to make them alluring mistresses than affectionate, wise, and rational mothers. The civilized women of the present century, with a few exceptions, are only anxious to inspire love, when they ought to cherish a nobler ambition, and by their abilities and virtues exact respect. My own sex, I hope, will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures, instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. All right, so what is the main idea here, and right, what is she doing here with Enlightenment ideals? Is she carrying on somebody's, or is she espousing somebody's ideals? Is she modifying somebody's ideals, or is she refuting what somebody has said? And of course, I always want to know who she is doing this to, right? Which Enlightenment philosophy. So please email that response to me, or just write it down and bring it into class when you return. All right. One kind of other person I do want to mention is kind of in this early women's equality, women's rights movement is Olympe de Gouges, right? So women are born and remain free and equal. All citizens, including women, are equally admissible to all public offices. All right. So the same time frame as Wollstonecraft, but she is French instead of British. So she's kind of in the middle of the French Revolution. And of course, what she does is a modification of an Enlightenment-inspired document. So for your homework last night, you had read the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens, or an excerpt from the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens. So what we're seeing here with Olympe de Gouges is a couple things. One is a modification of this Enlightenment-inspired document. We're modifying it to apply to women as well as men, right? So making the assertion that women have the same rights. Right, but she's also doing something different, right? So this is an important thing to kind of think about and to point out is, right, she also believes that children born outside of marriage should be treated as fairly as legitimate children, right, in matters of inheritance. So what is she doing here, right? This is not about women's equal access to public life. This is something unique, and this is something different. What you're seeing here is advocacy for issues that are important for women. All right, so kind of gender-specific issue advocacy. You can kind of see a beginning of it here, and of course, this is going to become an important thing for the overall suffrage movement, for the overall women's rights movement. So, if you want to get, women to rally around your call for increased rights, then finding issues that create enthusiasm would definitely do so. All right, so you look at this issue here about illegitimacy in children. Why haven't men, passed laws to create equality for illegitimate children with legitimate children, or children born out of wedlock versus children born in wedlock? Why hadn't men addressed those kinds of topics versus why would a woman be concerned with that topic even though men previously had not? All right, so it's kind of an interesting, thing to see, from an origination point of view, and we also see this, right, and modifications, as you kind of move down through the rights movement, right? For example, if you look at Seneca Falls, right, and what happens in Seneca Falls, right? We all know Seneca Falls. This is 1848. This is Seneca Falls, New York. This is that kind of really famous meeting in which the convention is called, and they're calling for for equal rights and the right to vote. And of course, but there's a whole lot more that's going on here as well. Right. So originally, right, it's known as the Women's Rights Convention. You can see that it's in 1648, and of course, we know the people who began this thing. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the meetings organizes, begins with a speech on the convention's goals. So what does she begin with here? We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give men power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in case of separation, the children of her love. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing a dual strategy here by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She is modifying Enlightenment-based ideals to adapt it to include women as well as men, right? So we're including women in this case, And we're also embedding advocacy for women's issues that would be important to women. All right. So yes. So we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. Right. That's how the conference begins. Right. Oh, sorry. This is how the Declaration of Sentiments begins. Right. Once again, modifying previously existing Enlightenment era documents. In this case here, this is from the Declaration of Independence, and advocacy for issues that are important for women, right? Asking for equality of education, equality in property ownership between men and women, equal child custody in the case of divorce, and of course, right to vote, right? So not everyone may want to fight for the right to vote, but you may bring more people under your umbrella by having issues that you're advocating that are important to them. So multiple issues that applied to a wider audience, right, will help create a bigger tent, right, for women's rights. All right, so that's what we talked about today. So if you're gone, once again, remember, don't forget to answer those questions about the Wollstonecraft quote. All right, so some key takeaways today. Enlightenment ideals, the idea that women are rational creatures and promotion of gender equality. And gender equality is going to face opposition from many fronts, right? And not going to get much help from Enlightenment thinkers. The progression towards the goal of gender equality and opposition will be a continuity for the rest of our course, right? So there will be this is something that we will discuss more, right, throughout the year. And of course, what gender equality means in the United States and Western Europe will not always be viewed the same in other parts of the world, right? So what we talked about today is largely a Western, a kind of European, United States, maybe Australia, New Zealand specific origin of the women's rights movements. So depending upon where in the world you are talking about, this may not be relevant, or even something that would be aspired to, right? So, and of course, so once we kind of get, into later units, we'll talk about how this movement here influenced early women's rights movements in places like South Asia, and of course how some of this stuff was also rejected, in parts of the world in the post-World War II era. So, right, so different parts of the world, this may or may not be as relevant. All right, that is all for today. Sabriati.